Hi, everybody. This is Blaine DeSantis, and I welcome you to another edition of Books and Looks. Yes, it's our weekly voyage of discovery in the wonderful world of books. Books that I've read and authors that I've interviewed. And before we get into today's show, I would just want to give you a little heads up. Coming next week is my annual Christmas wish list of books. That's right. You're not going to want to miss this one because we got some winners for you to put under that Christmas tree. That's right. Books that should be on your Christmas list or under your Christmas tree. That's coming next week. But before then, we have a spectacular show for you today. We have a new author. Her name is Jillian Forsberg, and she has written a fantastic historical fiction book called The Rhino Keeper. The Rhino Keeper by Jillian Forsberg. Spectacular book. It is about a Dutch sea captain who basically adopts an Indian rhino back in the 1740s and takes it all around Europe, showing it off to the world. It is a great story. I would say it's at least 85% historical, maybe 15% fiction. The details that go into are out of this world, including the fact that, did you know that rhinos can get sunburn? I never knew that, but it's true. And there's so many things here that you're not going to want to miss. So let's go right to that interview with Jillian Forsberg. Jillian, welcome to Books and Looks.
Thank you so much, Blaine. I'm so happy to be here with you.
And as I ask everybody, where are you coming to us from today?
I live in Wichita, Kansas, smack dab in the middle.
Yep, right there in the middle of the country. Good for you. Great. You always lived in Kansas?
No, actually, I was born in Florida, and my dad was a pastor and worked for the Salvation Army, and we moved around quite a bit when I was a kid, but I've lived the majority of my life in Kansas now.
Okay, so it's familiar territory for you.
Oh, for sure. Yeah.
Okay, good. Well, now, friends, we have had a lot of lawyers come on this show who have now become writers, but Jillian is a first. Jillian is and still is a bridal shop owner. And I can't wait to hear this. Just tell us, what's the journey from college to bridal shop owner to successful author? Tell us about that.
So I started college in McPherson, Kansas, and I double majored in communication and history. And when I was there, I needed a part-time job just to get me through school. So I went to the local bridal store that was downtown. I applied, I got the job. I graduated with my degree and I went on to grad school at Wichita State University. My master's degree is in public history, which is interpreting major historical events to those who have no context, museums, historical preservation, that type of thing. And once again, I needed a part-time gig to get me through grad school. I went to a bridal store. I applied. At that point, I'd had almost 4 years of experience. And so they hired me. And funny enough, I graduated with my master's degree in 2012. I got hired on as the director of a museum, and I never stopped working in bridal. After several years of working at my dream field, which was museums, I actually realized that I needed more change in my life. Museums are very repetitive, and there was a lot of things that just kept piling up that didn't satisfy me, mind, body, soul. So I went to the bridal store owner at that point in time and I said, "Hey, is there a full-time position here for me?" And she said, "Yes." So I started managing a bridal store in 2014. And 10 years later, I bought that store. But a few years before I bought it, I had decided that it was time for me to write my historical fiction novel, The Rhino Keeper. I had this plan when my daughter, who is now 9, was 5 and in kindergarten that I would write a book. Well, happenstance would be that that year was 2020, so I had more spare time than I originally thought I did. And I went back to my historical roots. It was my first time writing fiction, but what I found was that the balance between bridal and historical fiction noveling actually makes me extremely fulfilled. I'm able to satisfy that itch that everything needs to be different in the bridal store, but also by doing historical research and using my creative brain. So I'm really expanding into both realms, and I'm more satisfied now than I ever have been. And I think it's really interesting. And people are often asking me, how do bridal stores fit with history? And I always tell them that it's actually creating future history. When you have someone who says yes to a dress in my store, I'm actually helping create the relationship that will then someday be someone's grandparents' pictures of their wedding day. And that dress plays such an important role in creating future lives for these people. And eventually those future lives become the past to the future generations. So it's an interesting way to think about history, but it's history in the making instead of studying it. So that's how I became me.
That is Pretty neat. The Bridal Queen of Wichita, Kansas. I'll tell you, that's wonderful. I love that story. That's great. You needed a job, you got one of the bridal shop, and it just kept growing and growing. And then now, did you always want to write? That's the other question. Was that always something you wanted to do?
I've always been a writer, but more than that, I've always been an avid reader. In middle school, I was that kid who read a book a day. I just devoured novels. I would take accelerated reader tests in the morning, and the librarian would have a stack of books for me to choose from. And then the next day, it repeated itself. So, my dad was a writer as well. As I said, he was a pastor, but he also was a journalist. And when pastors write sermons, as a kid, you're sitting there listening to them speak and seeing them write and going through that process. And I've always been heavily edited by him my whole life, which I think is actually a really beneficial thing. But I started writing my first book when I was 12 in my grandparents' camper on a spring break trip, and I've just never stopped. I wrote in college, I wrote history papers. I won some newspaper awards, and I wrote history papers in my master's thesis. And it's funny that I never fully realized that I could combine my love for history with fiction until I had this idea for this book, The Rhino Keeper.
Yeah. Wow. So now you said you read a lot of novels as a kid. What were some of your favorites? Your favorite authors or favorite books?
Yes, my favorite author was Jean Craighead George. She wrote My Side of the Mountain, Julia the Wolves, nature-based, almost historical fiction type books. And all of them had animals, adventure, quirky protagonists who were young people. She just captured my essence as a child. I could imagine myself out there on the tundra surrounded by wolf puppies. Um, so yes, Jean Craighead George was definitely one of my favorites. I also I just loved anything fantasy based. So there's this book that really spoke to me by Laurel Winter called Growing Wings, where this young girl wakes up one day and realizes that she's been growing a pair of angel wings her whole life. So always those strange little stories, but also ones that were rooted in nature have always been ones that have really drawn me in.
Wow. Great. Well, that's wonderful. And this is the first time you considered doing historical fiction.
Yeah.
Okay.
I don't know
Well,
why it
that's
never occurred to me before.
I tell you what, I like to now that's why got me this question. The Rhino Keeper. What was that thunderbolt of inspiration that made you want to write this particular story?
I had that moment, and I actually have a photo of that moment. It's crazy when these things happen. I had goosebumps climb up my entire body when I first saw an Indian rhino. I had never seen one before in person. I had seen African rhinos in zoos and movies, but Indian rhinos, which are a rarer species than black or white rhinos, I'd never seen one in real life. So I was at a zoo in Salina, Kansas called the Rolling Hills Zoo with my daughter and husband. It was 2020. Once again, we were seeking socially distanced things to do. Zoos are outside, but it was really cold that day. So we popped into the rhino barn to see what was there and just kind of take a respite from the biting Kansas wind. And that's when I saw Joya the rhino. He was 6 foot at the shoulder, weighed 5 to 6,000 pounds, a monstrous animal. And he was kicking his food dish, demanding to be fed. And I just remember that moment like, what is this thing? He is huge. He is demanding. He was acting like a great big puppy. And I, being the nerd that I am, Googled the species, pulled up the Wikipedia page, read about it on the way home from the zoo. And at the bottom of that Wikipedia page about Indian rhinos was for more information, see Clara the rhino. I clicked it, and the first image I saw of her was Audrey's masterpiece, a life-size painting of Clara. If you think about how big Joya was, if he's 6 foot at the shoulder, that canvas is massive. I read that it was a shorter article than a stub article, and I read all the way to the bottom of it thinking, where's the historical fiction novel? I would love to read more about this. And it didn't exist. There were two picture books and a nonfiction book. The nonfiction book was written by a fabulous woman. Her name is Glynis Ridley. And I emailed Glynis when I got an idea to really fictionalize this. And to my surprise, she emailed me back in about 20 minutes and said, I would love to talk to you about novelizing Clara's story. She and I became fast friends. We still correspond. Her book came out 20 years ago, so she's discovered a lot more things since then, since archives have been digitized. And she handed over most of her sources to me and supported me and read the book early and blurbed me. I couldn't have gotten luckier for the expert in the world to say, not only do I give you all of my resources. I give you my blessing and all of my correspondence regarding this. So I felt very lucky to do that. And that lightning bolt moment, um, it was replayed a few weeks ago. I got to go back to the zoo. Sadly, Joya passed in 2021. He was almost 35, which is a great lifespan for a rhino. But I got to stand in that rhino bar again after giving a presentation about the Rhino Keeper. So it was a nice full circle
Wow.
moment.
Yeah, that's a great story. That's great. That's fantastic when one author helps another author, and can't beat stuff like that. That's really great. I bet she was gratified you wanted to write a novel about Clara, based on and partly upon her fictional nonfiction book, I should say. Yeah,
She was, and I think she was also really excited because her book came out so long ago that she didn't really have an outlet to put her new sources in. So that's been exciting too, is helping each other discover these new things since the internet is existing, in so much more leaps and bounds than it did in the early 2000s.
absolutely. Well, now before we get into the book, I like to ask people who write historical fiction this question: how much is history, and how much is creative inspiration? I think there's a lot of history in this.
There's a lot of history in this.
Yeah.
I am able to trace Clara's path through Europe based on art that was left behind. Art, documents of where she visited royals, her broadsides that are supposed to be pieces of ephemera. So you didn't expect those to last 300 years. Every single place that is mentioned is real. Every single real historical figure is real. The royals that she met, the porcelain maker, all of those stops that are documented in the book, I have proof that she was there, when she was there, and who she met. The problem with this book is that the in-betweens are what is lacking. And the Rhino Keeper himself, Dalmount Vandermeer, a Dutch East India ship captain, left behind no captain's log and no journals that have been found to talk about his personal relationship with Clara, who helped him, or what their lives were actually like together. So the answer, Blaine, is complicated because everything is true and everything is not true. If he would have left behind a journal, I think the story would be much more common and people would know about it. And I think because he was a common person, that's one of the reasons that a lot of people have never heard about this before. But because the royals kept such good documents and the artists were so enamored with her, all of the places and all of the real people mentioned in the book, that's the true story.
That's one. And as I mentioned to some people, the fiction is not something that is out of the realm of probability. A lot of these things make a whole heck of a lot of sense. We'll get into that, but I mean, you didn't have to have a big stretch to figure out, well, we need somebody here to do this, or we need somebody to do that, and this guy had to have some life other than the other than Clara. And so I thought it was a very logical, fictional filling in of the gaps. I thought it was marvelous, just marvelous. I gotta be honest with you. I love this book. And hey,
Thank
friends,
you.
what? This is the book, The Rhino Keeper. Look at this beautiful cover. Look at this beautiful cover.
It's
And
gorgeous.
Jillian sent it to me in wrapping paper, just like this. It was wonderful. I still have the wrapping paper. I mean, I've never gotten anything like that. It's so nice. This is a beautiful, beautiful book. Yeah. What can I say? It's just a great job. Just a great job. Well, now, first of all, you pronounce Captain Duamont and a lot different than I do. What's his name? Captain Duamont Bandamere? What is it?
Blaine, I think that's one of the worst things about this story is that the main character's name is so complicated. So we had 65 auditions for the audiobook, 65. And I listened to every single one of them with great intention of finding the perfect narrator. And I'm not kidding you, every single person pronounced his name differently.
Okay. Then
What
I'm
can you
not
do?
so weird saying. Yeah, I say Duamont.
Uh-huh. And at first I said do. So my internal says do. And that's because Glynis Ridley, the expert on Clara in the world, in my opinion, she said do. She's British. And then we hired our audiobook person who said, if you say do, then it sounds like do on grass, or do you want to go on a trading ship with me?
Oh,
And so it's
okay.
difficult for a listener. She contacted Dutch speaking people and they all agree that it's probably Dawe, which is fine. but I have not corrected anyone on how to say his name because the truth is, we can't go back to 1740 and ask the guy. Whatever makes the reader comfortable. I've heard Dewey, I've heard Dow, whatever you want to say.
I shorten it to Dewey, but
Yes.
Dewey, Dowie, Dow, whatever. Wow, that's fascinating. We don't even know how the gentleman's name's pronounced. That's fascinating. Well, now, this gentleman is in Calcutta, India at the time. Why was he there? And how did he end up getting to own Clara? Tell us a little bit about that.
So at this point in history, this is the late 1730s, early 1740s, the Dutch had actually taken over a lot of India. We often think about India being a colony for the British, but it actually was a Dutch colony first because of the VOC, the Dutch East India Trading Company. That was one of the largest organizations in the world. It was the first multinational corporation. They had their own money minted. They had thousands of employees. They had thousands of trading ships. And they went from Rotterdam or Amsterdam around the Horn of Africa, which is one of the most dangerous sea voyages on the planet. The Suez Canal did not exist yet, not until the 1800s. And they went to India, Japan. Bengal was huge for them. They went on to Batavia. They traveled the east, essentially, bringing back trade goods and taking European goods there and creating this network, this globalization that was brought on by the Dutch. And one of their headquarters was in Calcutta. So Calcutta had Fort William, and that place was basically a Dutch stronghold. 2 years after Douwe and Clara leave, the British take over. So they're on the cusp of this massive amount of change. And Douwe is there because he is trading and on a ship called the Nappenhof. He was the captain of that ship. He joined the VOC when he was 15 years old. We have those records and know that about him. He became a captain when he was about 35. And the Nappenhof was a real ship. It was a three-masted Dutch East Indiaman that had about 6 tons of capability for hauling. He had a crew of about 100. They were from all over the world, spoke multi-languages, all different colors, all different ilks. This was a very diverse crew, which, if you know anything about trading, it always was. So he was in Calcutta mostly because of work. And it's interesting because his personal life really didn't reveal much about why he was there. But if he's a young man trying to make his way up on the ladder of the VOC, he wouldn't have been focused on much but work. His commander's name was Jan Sichterman, and Sichterman was also a real person. Sichterman and his wife Sibylla had a stunning house. He was in charge of India's trade at that point. He came across a baby Indian rhino at a market. We know that her mother was killed by hunters. We do not know if Douwe bought her or was gifted her from Sichterman himself. That is not clear. What we do know is she ended up on the Nappenhof for a 6-month sea voyage in 1740 into 1741. Why? That's the biggest question of all. Why would you take a rhino on a ship? And the answer is such an overarching theme for the 18th century itself. It's really because people were desperate for wonder, for knowledge, for quirkiness. They had free time. They were learning to read and write. People wondered for some of the first times in history about what life was like outside of their own neighborhoods. And Clara encapsulated that wonder in an animal where people said, she existed somewhere else, and the world exists somewhere else outside of my small hamlet or my city in Europe. So I really think that he took her back to Europe basically to showcase her, but he also probably did think that he could make some money off of her. But interestingly enough, his first stop when he returned was not a place to make money. It was a college in Leiden University, which is one of the oldest universities in Europe. They have an incredible history of anatomy, physiology, botany studies, and animal studies. Their anatomy chamber is one of the most documented in early modern European history. And Clara visited there, and that is where her likeness was first really captured.
I like that. Hey, Clara visited there. Clara visited a lot of people. That's wonderful. And she was how old when he got her? Do we know?
It's kind of debated in the book itself. She was about 6 months old when he got her. We think she might have been 2 to 3 when she actually went on the Nappenhof, but for the book's purposes, I made her a baby so that we could ground her in a growth pattern because she is a character of her own. So think about this: the size of a 6-month Indian rhino weighs about 200 pounds. And in 6 months, that animal would triple in size, which means when he was stocking his ship for food for her, he had no clue how much this creature was going to eat. You cannot just stop off at a random island and get the food for her. So he had to have, in order to keep her alive, been prepared for that kind of animal on his ship as well.
Now, you make it sound as if this is his last, voyage. Do we know if that was his last voyage?
So there have been new documents that have turned up that he might have taken another one in between Clara's age 2 to 3. That is scant documentation on VOC records. Glennis Ridley and I did not ever come across those records when we were doing our research. So in the book, that is his last voyage. And then Clara basically becomes his new Nappenhoff.
All right. All right. Now, then I'm jumping ahead of what some of my questions were, but I'm going to do this because this is actually a dual timeline book.
Yes.
Because now we come up to the present day. Tell us about, there's a mystery here. Who are some of those characters? I don't want to focus a lot on the mystery because Clara is so doggone interesting. Tell us about the modern day situation.
Sure. I'll tell you why I wrote that. When I finished writing the historical part of that, my mentor, her name is Jenna Blum, she asked me, what happened to Clara's remains? And in a lot of art of Clara, her horn is removed, and there's someone in that art holding her horn. What happened to her horn? She was 5,000 pounds when she died in 1758. Um, Rhino horn back then and today, especially in the black market, are extremely valuable, worth more than gold. It is has no medicinal purposes, but that myth keeps coming forward. And I really thought about what did happen to her, and that question just didn't leave me. And I talked to Jenna about that. She said, "Well, what if you wrote that? If your readers are going to have that same question of what happened to her after her death and what kind of legacy did she leave behind, don't you think that you should include that in the book?" And also, part of the reason I wrote the modern timeline is because a lot of modern readers are not familiar with the 18th century. It's especially the earlier parts of it. People know about the revolutions, the French Revolution, the American Revolution, but the 1740s and 50s were a time of very interesting happenings politically, culturally. And those things needed to be walked through for a reader who has no context of what the 1700s was like, which goes back to my master's degree of how can I explain this to people who have no context so they feel comfortable in this world. So those characters in 2022, modern characters, are based off of real people. The professor, Paul Hahn, is based off of one of my favorite professors at McPherson College, where I got my undergrad, whose name is Ken Yon, hilariously enough. And Andrea Clarkson is what is basically me if I had gone through an entirely different life. Andrea experiences a lot of trauma early on in this book, and Andrea is seeking herself. She goes into an interesting internship at a museum on the university campus where they have to document a historical graveyard. That's a dream gig for any college student. And basically why I did that was because people needed to understand, A, Clara was real. B, I think I did discover, in actuality, where her remains are. The Grant Museum in London cannot prove nor deny that their very old Indian rhino skeleton is or is not Clara, because the documentation is very scant. And that's one of my favorite things about this is we may never know, but I think having some kind of solid answer as to what happened to our sweet rhino after she passed away is very satisfying for the reader. And on top of that, we do get to see the impact and those Easter egg moments. There's a historical desk. There are some artifacts that are mentioned that are in the museum that are on the Nappenhof itself. There is a black cat that weaves itself through both timelines. So those little things are also fun for readers to connect the dots.
That's wonderful. So which one did you enjoy writing more, the historical fiction part, the 1740s, or modern day?
I don't know if I can choose that because I absolutely love the idea of being the one to uncover what happens to Clara at the end. And I would love to be in a museum when they show me the archive of her. But my heart lies with Clara. She lived for Versailles for a month. She met these incredibly royal, important people, but she also touched the lives of paupers and ship captains. And I don't know if I can pick, Blaine.
Okay. Well, that's okay. We'll let the reader pick which one they like the most. That's okay. Now, one of your fictional characters is a young boy named Zubin, Zubin. Um, how was he important to Dewey, and Clara?
I found two pieces of art that show a dark-headed boy. One of them is inside Clara's enclosure with her, and the other is leaning his chin on a board outside of her enclosure, and he just has this inquisitive look. I know that there's no way that a Dutch man would know how to care for an exotic animal like Clara without help. And I knew that in India, she would have been cared for by someone who knew how to care for her, or she would have died. Um, so Zubin was born of those two boys and also of the need for Clara to have an actual person who knew how to care for her because nothing else logically makes sense. But Zubin is also a very complicated character. Zubin is a comic relief. He is a sweet boy. He's actually my favorite character in the whole book, but he is also a metaphor for colonialism. A lot of people of color were brought to Europe against their will. I had a book club discussion on if Zubin was a slave. The answer is yes, he was a slave. He made a choice to go with Clara, but his complicated life, his ability to choose to go with Clara and abandon his homeland, also means that we have to think about, is it okay to take people out of places where they are comfortable, even if it is their decision to go? Is it okay to take animals out of their natural habitats, even if we feel we don't have a choice? Zubin is important not only to show us that side of this story, but he's also important to kind of ground Dawa in a way that says, hey, you need to focus on what's best for our animal and not focus on what's best for you and money. And he does that several times. He also grows along with Clara. Their lives kind of parallel each other. And I think he brings a lot of heart into this. And I hope that people understand that he's not just the comic relief. He's not just an Indian boy. He is someone who's extremely important to the overarching theme of this book, and that is that piece of colonialism.
A- And like I said, it made logical sense. You saw something, you saw a picture, two pictures, and this makes logical sense. How is Dowie going to take care of Clara on a boat? He has to have somebody with him. It just makes sense. He can't do it all himself. And so this is one of those logical, creative inspirations you had that I thought permeate this entire book. It's very well done. I really enjoyed that.
Thank you.
Let's talk a little bit about villains, because we're going to get to all the
Mhm.
other places, but there's a villain in here.
There's more than one villain. Yeah.
Well, there are, but that one guy's he's really bad. Tell us a little bit about
Yeah.
him.
Gregor. So, um, villains are interesting. Sometimes villains can overarchingly take over a book, and I didn't want that to happen. And so the villain really comes in at the last half. Part of the wonder of the 18th century was this addition of celebrity for the first time. The royals became more famous. People were reading about them more because they could actually read. Clara was considered the first animal celebrity, and that's partly because her advertising was so good. But along with celebrity comes people who worry, people who are not fans, and people who are so religious based. Iconography was a huge thing too, but people who are so religious based that they fear that God is going to be lessened by the existence of somebody or something. That was normal. Idol worship was something that was very much frowned upon. People had to be careful about what they said about royals. New celebrities like Voltaire were coming forward. And with Clara, she was compared to the behemoth of Job in almost all of the writings about her. That is interesting because the behemoth of Job is not a positive character in the Bible. The behemoth of Job is something that's a creature of destruction. But Clara was a gentle creature. And all of the writings about her say the same thing. Come meet the behemoth of Job, but know that she's gentle. That contrast is really interesting. So Gregor was born of this understanding that celebrity is new, celebrity is scary. What happens when celebrity actually becomes something negative? And in Gregor's mind, he sees this kind of like the pastor on Footloose, where it's like, hello, does nobody see the danger here? You are giving her your money. You are feeding her your food. You are worshiping her outside of the church. These are things that you need to rein in. Make sure that you are not going against everything that you know to be true, good Christians. And basically, he loses everything by doing that. If you write this book from the perspective of Gregor, he's protecting his constituents, his congregation. If you write this book from the version of Maria Theresa's viewpoint, who Gregor was her priest, you see it as she is now in conflict with her own mind of, this animal brings joy. My priest says that this is inappropriate. What decision do I make? And those decisions are made almost for her when Gregor does some very questionable things. But Gregor also, when he loses his position, spoiler alert, when he loses his position, he makes some really strange decisions as well based on panic. And I think a lot of people who are experiencing something new and something frightening, which if a dinosaur walked through your town, which is what Clara basically looked like, you would probably be frightened too. But the interesting thing there, Blaine, is I talked about the art from Clara. In one moment, Clara is shown with this beautiful, shining, sharp rhino horn. And in the next image drawn of her, her horn is gone from her head and it is in the hand of a person in the crowd. How did that happen? There's no documentation. Why did that happen? We do not know. That horn is so valuable. And so I thought to myself, do I need to dramatize this, or would this have been traumatic for Clara? And how did she lose her horn? If it wasn't documented, why did they keep it a secret? And how were they able to hold on to that horn, not sell it at auction, and not have it stolen? So those things propelled me forward once again with thinking, we've got art that asks questions, and I want answers to those questions.
So now, was Gregor a real person? Was he a historical character?
No, he was not a historical character, but Maria Theresa did have many priests, and she really did have a chapel down in her bedchambers and would receive mass every morning there.
Okay. All right. Well, that's wonderful. Now, let's talk a little bit about how much did Clara eat? And how much would it cost to feed an animal like that? My Lord. Tell us a bit about her eating habits.
So sadly, her eating habits were not proper for her species today.
Yeah.
Clara loved what all rhinos love: fruit, vegetables, produce of any kind, but she also ate bread. She's not supposed to eat bread. She's not supposed to eat oranges in great amounts. It can actually lead to some serious problems with the liver for rhinos, and they're not supposed to have that much citrus. So that was an interesting thing that I read about too, that might have led to her demise, was her poor diet. She drank a lot of beer. She loved to inhale tobacco smoke. You know, the girl had her vices. What can you say? And I read that basically she was made it possible to do a lot of things by snacks. If you need her to get into her carriage, you offer her something delicious and she will do what you need her to do. Today, rhinos eat a lot like horses with a little more sweets thrown in. So they do have bananas, produce, hay, pellets, all of those types of things, lots of lettuce. They do graze. They eat, one of their delicious treats is mulberry leaves here in Kansas at the zoos that I go to. If you bring a mulberry stick for those animals, they absolutely love it. But they have a prehensile lip so that they can pull leaves off of branches. They are grazers and they are foragers. Clara would have been very expensive to feed. And that is one of the reasons that they charged admission to see Clara and to feed Clara. She would have eaten 5 pounds of hay a day minimum. So we're talking something. And on top of that, you have to think, if Clara is in the area, so are her draft horses that took her there or the oxen that took her there. So she would have been an expensive girl to haul around, not just because of her carriage, but because you also had to feed the animals that were allowing her to be led around Europe.
This conversation, I always tell my authors, we may get some questions, none questions. You don't know where our conversation is going to go. This is going everywhere. I love this.
Yeah, good.
Talk about the art. Because here, this is something you bring out in the book, that until Clara got up to the northern territories, up north, everybody had one picture of what was a rhino supposed to be, and it was supposed to be a killer. How did that happen to begin with, and how did Clara then change that perception?
School children were taught that rhinos were man-eating beasts, that they were the mortal enemies of elephants, and that they would devour someone in one bite. Rhinos are basically big dogs. But they're not meat eaters. They are lovable, intelligent creatures that only attack when they are terrified. And the biggest risk from a rhino is being trampled. They do not fight elephants. They do not go after people to eat them at all. They can't even open their mouths that wide. They are herbivores. So those teachings were completely incorrect. But if you look at a rhino, they are scary looking. They have sharp horns. They're massive. Clara's species was armored, so it looks like they're ready for battle. But all of those things permeated the view of Europeans for so many years because they didn't have proof of anything else. Now, there were 4 to 5 rhinos before Clara in Europe. However, they did not live very long. They lived about 6 months. One of them lived a few years, but she was purposefully blinded so that they could control her. I know they were not treated well, and I think a lot of that was based on fear, based on the ancient teachings of Pliny the Elder. So, what happened in the 1500s, so 200 years before Clara makes it to Europe, was an incredible medieval artist named Albrecht Dürer, one of my favorites of all times. He drew very lifelike things. He's got very famous drawings of grass, of animals, of plants. All of those things are so lifelike that you could look at them and compare them to living things today, and you may not know the difference. He did a woodcut of a rhino. That woodcut was the thing that was in encyclopedias, books, teachings that rhinos were supposed to look like. But here's the problem. Dürer, who's considered one of the best artists, never saw a rhino. He had a sketch from a sea captain, and he had a physical description of a rhino. The rhino that he drew died in a shipwreck off the coast of Portugal in the early 1500s. Sadly, rhinos of this breed can swim very well, but that animal's legs were chained together and it drowned 20 yards from shore. Heartbreaking. But Dürer still drew it, and that is called Dürer's rhino. It was one of the first images to go viral, if you will. It's an incredible piece of art. I love it. It is stunning. And if you compare Clara's art to Dürer's art, there's really not that much difference, but then you look closely and there is. He got a lot of things right, the armor, the texture, all of those little things, but he also got a lot of things wrong. There's a dorsal horn on the back of Dürer's rhino. The texture of the skin isn't quite there. It's got strange whiskers. But for never having seen a rhino, Dürer did pretty good. So when Clara came to Europe, all of that changed. Imagine seeing something in your mind's eye your entire life if you're an educated person, and then the real thing walks up to you and it is entirely different from what you thought. She literally changed perspectives. And I imagine that people wondered, what is wrong? Dürer's rhino, or is Clara an anomaly? And when people started to paint and draw her, and then something that I left out of the book, I'm going to have to write a short story about it. She actually met Carl Linnaeus, the father of modern biology, and she was the genotype that was named Rhinoceros unicornis and fully described by him. That helped dispel Dürer's rhino even more when Linnaeus named her.
Hmm. Wow. That's something. Well, now, yeah, and we don't have, we got around 7, 8 minutes to go, but tell us a little bit about Clara's expeditions, her trips. Where did she go in Europe? That's what a itinerary she had.
Oh yeah. She went on a full grand tour. It was incredible. Clara touched almost every spot in Europe that you could possibly think of. She met royals in Versailles. She was in Rome. She was in Paris. She was in lots of places in Germany. She was at Christmas markets. She was at the Leipzig Easter Fair. She basically made the rounds. Like Clara's grand tour was a real deal. Kind of like the royals went on their grand tours, so did she. But this was over the span of 18 years. So she did take breaks. She did end up staying for a while in Holland and different various places there. But really, the neatest things for me are the documented places that she went. We usually have broadsides of those. She stayed at a lot of taverns. But that girl was more well-traveled than most of us ever will be. Think about this. She went from India, around the Horn of Africa, up to Rotterdam, traveled Europe all the way down to the boot of Rome. If you can imagine her voyage, she touched almost everything. And almost everywhere she went, she was drawn, celebrated. The broadsides were made. So we've got all this documentation, the dates, how much it cost to feed her. My favorite thing is that they described her as being the color of a freckled toad. You can't make this stuff up. Name a famous palace, she was likely there, even for a small amount of time, to stay in the menagerie, to wow the royals, to wow their children. She really saw it all. And the fact that she lived that long and the fact that she was so well known and loved and cherished says something about the keeper who loved her.
Yeah, absolutely. And if not just Dowie, at least there's Zubin. who's now growing up with
Yes,
him too, and so it's
exactly.
very good. Yeah, very interesting. Wow. Well, she's with gets to the Palace of Versailles. Now, you have a little story in there in which there comes a point in time when Dowey has to decide, does he want to keep Clara or does he want to get rid of Clara? Is this historical? Did you find documents on this?
I sure did. Yes. For some reason, he offered to sell Clara to King Louis XV for 100,000 écus. That is documented. And I could not, Blaine, figure out why. First of all, that price is astronomical. It is so much money. So it's almost like he didn't want to sell her because he knew that he would be told no at that price. But why offer it in the first place? The readers are going to have to read that part of the book to figure that out because, like you said, the logic that comes into that, the only thing that made sense was that his heart was torn and he had to make a choice. But King Louis says no.
Because somebody else made the choice for him.
That's right. That's right. Someone else made the choice for him. But yes, there were some puzzling little moments like that. Like, why would he choose to do that? I couldn't tell you why, but I had to imagine it for this to move forward. And I think that the reason why it does logically make sense for our ship captain. But yes, that moment was real. And when I came across that, I was startled. And I think that's the majority of people who read this book and have those questions about those few moments. Why would he do that? Well, that was the entire puzzle piece that I had to put together.
Yeah, there's just enough. You get enough to whet your appetite, but you can't get the whole meat and potatoes of everything. It's just right
Exactly.
beyond your,
Yeah.
right there. What you did with the fill in, again, it makes so much logical sense. And that's what I love about this book. And that's a good writer who can do that. And it
Thank
may be
you.
your first published historical fiction, but you're a good writer. I can tell you that much. It's a wonderful job. Now, how long do these Indian rhinos actually live?
So people back then thought they lived to be 100 years. That is not correct. They lived to be about 35 to 40 in the wild and in captivity. So Clara lived about 20 years, which is about half of their life expectancy, but with zero vet care, no husbandry knowledge, and a really poor diet. That's actually it's pretty dang good, and a stressful life. Like rhinos don't like to be moved. So if you think about that versus her counterparts, which lived about 6 months in captivity, they really treated Clara well.
It's interesting. A couple weeks ago, I interviewed a young lady about a book she did about the Galapagos Islands. And she talked about one gentleman of Astor who came down to the Galapagos and took some of their penguins up to New York. Paddle Wing, I think was the name of the he called it. He took them around New York, sat in the back of his car and everything else. Oh, it was wonderful, wonderful. And 6 months later, the poor penguin was dead. It's the same thing. You just can't, except for Clara, you just couldn't do it. I mean, there had to be this symbiote. There had to be a relationship.
Yes, and that's exactly what I asked of modern rhino keepers. I when I explained this story to them and said her counterparts lived to be 6 months in captivity, why on earth would this one have lived longer? All of the rhino keepers that I spoke to that care for these animals today said they had to have been bonded and had a simple understanding of one another, and her needs must have been met, or she wouldn't have made it.
Wow. Well, now, in the end, we think we may have found Clara's remains. We're not sure, but we may under the modern timeline. How would she have ended up being in London? How would that have happened?
It was part of her grand tour. So Clara was actually in London twice. I skipped one of them because it didn't make sense for my timeline, and there are couple other places like Carl Linnaeus that I had to leave out. Blaine,
Mm-hmm.
when I first finished this book, it was close to 150,000 words, and published it's around
Oh my God.
94,000 words. I know. So I have what I call the director's cut still in my computer. So she did meet the royal family twice, and really, London and Amsterdam were not that far away, and Amsterdam was close to Clara's home base, so she would have had to taken a boat to get there, a barge, and she was on several barges. She stood freely on the decks of many ships. So she ended up in London in 1758. I have a broadside that says, "To be seen, the rare and wonderful rhinoceros," and then it describes her in English, which is brilliant because I did a lot of Google Translate for this. And it actually describes the place where she was going to be, and again, how much it was to feed her. So in 1758, I knew that she was there in April.
Yeah, because as important as Leiden was as a university, I was sort of thought when the ultimate demise came, she would have been up there at that location, but that's not where she ended. Well, we're not sure where she ended up, but we think she didn't end up there.
Right. I always thought that too, but I think hauling her back home would have been an enormous and expensive undertaking. I once again, I wish that I could read the Rhino Keeper's papers and that he would have said, "We chose to leave her here because." And it's almost painful to not have any of that record. I really wonder if he wrote anything down, but I think that it would have been kept if he did. And if I owned the only rhino in Europe, you better believe I would be documenting everything, but he just
Y-
didn't.
Yep, didn't do that. Wow.
Nope.
There is so much. I mean, I never knew that rhinos can get sunburn. I never knew that. And
Yes.
there they are. How did you find
Yes.
that out?
The keepers, and rhinos are supposed to have mud baths, and even keepers today will make mud and slap it on a rhino so that they don't get sunburned. And the fish oil was documented as well. We knew that her skin was kept moist by fish oil on the Nappenhof. So all of those strange little things I have documentation for ended up in the book, and I absolutely love that about it. But that's one of those quirky things where some of the rhino keepers were like, well, I would never know if they could get sunburned because I wouldn't let it get that bad. So the assumption is the soft folds in between their plates of armor would definitely get wind chapped or burned by the sun if they were on the deck of a ship. And so the fish oil had to happen. Otherwise, she would have been flaky and miserable.
Right. Again, those are little details. You think, well, she's just making that up. No, she's not making that up. This is amazing
No,
research. Just utterly amazing. I've got
thank
another
you.
hour's worth of questions, but I don't have more time. You don't have to get going. I got to get going. But what is coming up next for Jillian Forsberg? Do you have a new book coming out soon, or what are some future projects you might be thinking of?
I do. I will always write animal historical fiction. The first thing that's coming out that's exciting is the audiobook of The Rhino Keeper, read by Carolyn Hewitt. That is coming out February 14th, 2025. And I am so excited for everyone to hear this. I think that her interpretation of this book actually enhances the story even more. It's beautiful and brilliant, and her emotional pull is just so well done. But next is actually a companion to the Rhino Keeper. This hasn't been announced formally yet, but I hope you remember Johann Candler, the porcelain maker, in this book. His story fascinated me as well, and I delved deeper into his origin story at Mice and Porcelain. And the Porcelain Menagerie is coming out October 21st, 2025, and Clara does make a cameo in that book.
Wow, that's super. That's just
Yeah.
great. And I know I'm not supposed to give plugs here, but I'm going to tell you what. You got a wonderful publisher for this book. I love Colin Mustful. I love the history through fiction stuff. Everything he puts out, again, more history than fiction, and he gets
Yes.
very good writers before people even have heard of them. And just like you, it's wonderful. You've done a super job. Like I said, I could go on and on and on, friends. It's just great. I got to stop and say, you know what, Jillian, thank you so much for coming on today. We look forward to your future works, folks. Get the book, get the audio, whatever. You don't want to miss this. But anyway, thank you for coming on today on Books and Looks, Jillian.
Thank you so much, Blaine, for having me. It's been a joy.
Well, friends, that's one heck of a book. I'm going to tell you what, that was a great historical research by Jillian. She did a great job, and the whole story makes perfect logical sense. You're going to really want to read this one. And as I said in the beginning, what am I looking to? Well, I'm looking forward to next week's Christmas wish list. That's right, my annual Christmas wish list of books is coming next week. I'm going to be recording that. There'll be a lot of excitement. Which ones make the list and which ones don't? They're all great books, but I have to make a list somewhere. So let's see this coming out by the next week. So anyway, on behalf of my good friends at Podcast Studio X, this is Blaine DeSantis for Books and Looks, saying may all your leaves be pages in a book.